Okay, it's recording. So I'm Natalie Patton. I have an LCSW. I'm currently employed by the Center for Women and Families as therapist slash project manager. I'm employed through a grant by the OVC that is looking to address barriers and gaps in services for people who have coexisting domestic violence, sexual assault, and mental illness and or substance use. Um, I'm also the therapist here, which is part of that. So I see folks one-on-one or in group. I, for the past about 9 years, I've worked in some capacity for emergency psychiatry services, which is known as EPS at U of L Hospital. Uh, I'm employed there through Centerstone, and I've worked for Centerstone, which is the community mental health agency for this region. I've worked for Centerstone for about 13 years. So that was my start in mental health career was in 2005 with Centerstone. I still work at EPS PRN, so still there, and then here, of course. So what I've seen in working, specifically in thinking about working at EPS, because the hospital is often one of the only, if not the only place that people who are homeless feel like the door is open to them, because by law, an emergency department cannot turn away someone who is presenting with a complaint without triaging that person and assessing their need for medical intervention. So with that being said, when it is cold out or hot out or rainy out or any kind of variety of things, and it's the middle of the night, because I worked third shift for a few years steadily full time, then a lot of the population of people in Louisville who are homeless in downtown come into the emergency room. And sometimes that's into the medical emergency room, sometimes that's over to emergency psychiatry. So I say all that to say I've actually gotten to know quite a few people who live on the streets and are primarily street homeless, excuse me, in addition to people who reside at shelters, whether that be temporary and then move to a different one, or in and out, or who are staying there for a little longer term in transitional kinds of ways. So through all that, then I've gotten some understanding, I feel like, of the way a lot of the homeless population, at least the population that feels the need to seek out some kind of connection or service at the hospital, what their experiences are. And so not only do people walk in for services to the hospital, the police will often bring them there. So when the police get involved, that can either be because the person chose to call the police, or because someone else called the police, or the police just happened to roll up on the person. It's my understanding that all LMPD are required now to be CIT trained, which is Crisis Intervention Team, meaning that they should have some kind of additional training on responding to incidents that occur that involve someone who is either suspected to have a mental illness or is, for lack of a better word, behaving in a way that would indicate some kind of mental health concerns going on. So even with that training, it still varies the way the police will respond, and which is understandable because every situation they respond to is different. But I think there's still room there for more education and understanding on behalf of a lot of the folks who work in the police department for these folks who have mental illness, and also for the folks that, we would never want to put police officer in a place where they are needing to make a decision in that moment about whether or not someone actually has mental illness. I mean, that's not their job, and that's not what they're trained to do. Um, but with that being said, there's been several situations where police officers will respond a um, to a call. The person that they're responding on will say that they have a mental illness, and rather than that person going to jail, that person will be brought to the hospital. Now, in certain situations, that's understandable and acceptable, but what has happened and what we at EPS have actually talked with the CIT sergeant about is that occasionally this happens where a person commits a violent act and then will claim to have, when the police arrive, will claim to have a mental illness, and instead of being taken to jail, they'll be brought to the hospital. And the charges that they would have been charged with, maybe they will get a citation for and a court date. So then the hospital almost feels responsible for letting someone back out, if you will, if they don't, meet criteria for hospitalization, if they don't appear, to be, if it doesn't appear to be mental illness, then that falls back on the hospital with someone who's actually committed a crime, and the crime is not related to mental illness. I mean, they've proven that folks with mental illness are more likely to be the victims of crime, violent crime included, than be violent. So a couple of instances that I'm thinking of is a person who set a fire, trying to speak really generally, so arson being a felony and a huge, safety issue obviously for the community, and what's claimed to have a mental illness, and instead of having the option for the hospital to call the police if discharged, they were essentially just dropped off at the hospital. Because what can happen is the police can bring them to the hospital to be evaluated and leave paperwork that protects the hospital from liability with HIPAA. If the person is discharged, they can call the police, because the police bring a paper that says, according to this and this law, essentially HIPAA doesn't apply here. You can call us when they're discharged. They're going to come pick them up, and they're going to process them through with the charges and whatever that should look like. So when that happens, that's ideal, because then we can know that we're not locking up someone with a mental health issue, but at the same time we're not releasing someone back out into the community who's posing a risk because of their criminal activity that has nothing to do with any mental health issue. So we've seen that happen with crimes, across the board. The violent crimes are the ones that, are the most disturbing, I feel like, whenever someone is brought in after they've been violent towards someone else, but yet they're brought to the hospital with essentially a court date, and then we're turning around and releasing them without the option to notify anyone that that's the outcome. And in some cases that it means that when we feel like the safety risk is too high, that there's too much danger involved in releasing them, that we end up having to hospitalize someone in a psychiatric setting without actually having sometimes without actually having a legitimate diagnosis for that, just to protect the community or the person, or just to protect ourselves from the liability of releasing someone. And when that happens, it affects everyone involved. It affects these the patients who need those psychiatric beds, because that takes up a bed in a limited bed system. It affects the people on the unit on to which they're admitted, because we've admitted someone who's not going to benefit from treatment or needs treatment into a milieu where there are people who are, psychiatrically ill. And that person, it then essentially puts some form of diagnosis on them in order to be able to admit them. And then what's that going to mean down the line? So I think what would be great to see happen would be to have the police and the hospital, and in my experience being in the hospital, have some more open communication and dialogue in how can we prevent people from falling through the cracks. If processing through the correction system is the appropriate route, how can we determine that ensure that happens to protect? Now, jumping a little bit, with Centerstone opened what they call the living room about maybe a year or so ago. Maybe it hasn't been that long. And one of the things that the living room, one of the goals was to essentially be some diversion from jail for folks who maybe were picked up and it was trespassing, it was, disorderly conduct, it was some kind of minor infraction where no one was really being hurt, but the police felt that they needed to remove the person from the street. So when that system is working, then that can give someone the opportunity to avoid jail for a small nonviolent offense, and be in a safe place to potentially connect with mental health resources and or substance use resources. That's been a process that they've been working through, and how police identify who goes there versus who goes to the hospital, that they've been working through and identifying what's safe for the living room as far as the people they bring in, because they're not a facility that they're not medically equipped, and they're not security's not present there, so they have to kind of weigh some of those things around. Let's see.
I think you might have touched on everything.
You think so?
Mm-hmm.
You said about the homeless population with mental illness and the lack of ability to get resources.
Yes.
So all I was going to say about that, I can keep talking, I'm a talker, but just the follow-up, the lack of ability to get resources, I think just the understanding that what we're asking people to do is to follow up and to follow through with navigating what are really complex systems, when so much mental illness involves symptoms and behaviors that actually prevent them to do that. I mean, depression results in lack of motivation. Psychosis results in often disorganization of thought. So much of, and that's just two examples. I mean, you can pull, just the exact things that, if someone who is coping well with the mental illness or who's not diagnosed with the mental illness, not struggling, may still struggle with trying to move through systems. And then we're asking people who are, actively symptomatic often to keep an appointment, to go to a certain place, to then follow to another certain place, to understand, the different places that do different things. So we end up just seeing people cycling through the system, which, having worked at EPS, there's folks that I've known and worked with, longer than a lot of people in my regular life of who I've just seen cycle through jail and then hospital and then discharged to the street or to a shelter, only to find themselves back in jail, back to the hospital, back to the street or the shelter. And each system, if you will, will often say, well, this should be the other system's responsibility to, to ensure that this cycle is broken. But none of those systems are really set up to do that. So we, find our folks just continuously moving through. Jail's not the appropriate place for them because, yes, they really do have a mental health condition. They've been found that, psychiatrists, they've determined they are incompetent to stand trial to all of this. But a person can only reside or only stay in a hospital so long, and a shelter only has so much structure. So it's just a continuous cycle. So